Well, thanks very much, Alan, and welcome everyone to our stakeholder engagement event on the National Economic Plan here as Tánaiste, also Minister of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, and as Chair of the Cabinet Subcommittee that deals with the economy and economic recovery. I have attended events like this for as long as I've had the privilege of being a minister, for more than 10 years now, or I'll be 10 years soon, but this is the weirdest occasion, and so much of what we're doing is so unusual and so different now. But we'll all adapt and we'll all learn, and when this is over, we'll take the best of what we've learned and also restore the best of what we've lost as well as that. So thanks very much for joining us all today, and as you know, it comes at a critical time for the country. We had a budget last week, and one that's almost forgotten about at this stage, but one that was historic in many ways in terms of the level of spending and the amount of investment going into our economy and our society. We're dealing with the challenges of Brexit and also the pandemic and the awful impact that's having on our society and on our economy as well. So in terms of the overall framework for our a new economic plan, it is based, of course, on sound public finances. We entered this pandemic, this economic and public health crisis, with our public finances in good shape, with a budget surplus, with a rainy day fund, and with falling debt. And that, along with central bank policy, allowed us to borrow the kind of money we're borrowing now this year, and we'll borrow again the year after. But fundamentally, we can't move away from the wisdom of managing our public finances soundly, because the debt that we're incurring will have to be refinanced and rolled over, perhaps in 10 or 20 years' time, and the deficit that we will have, no doubt, in 2022 and 2023, we'll have to borrow to cover that, and we want to make sure that we're able to borrow and those interest rates are low. So we need to make sure that we keep our public finances sound and have a trajectory to reduce the deficit over the next couple of years. As Pascal would often say, we have no desire to be the best boy in the European class, to be the strictest adherence to the fiscal rules, but what we want to be is in the pack, mid-table, in that group with our peer countries like the Benelux countries, like Denmark, Germany, the Nordic countries, having deficits of that order. And that's what we'll aim to stay, where we'll aim to stay, and where we'll aim to get back to as the recovery happens. Also, a big focus of this plan is going to be strategic investment. It is a 5-year plan for the economy. What we'll do over the next 5 years will transform the next 20. So a lot of it is about investment in those areas that are all about the future. For example, digital, investments in climate action, and also investments in skills and people and education, all the things that will create wealth and create value in the years to come. In terms of the thematic areas, one is of course building resilience across enterprise and sectors. As Alan mentioned, an inclusive and balanced recovery, so that the economy and society we have after this is better than the one that we left behind. People often use the analogy of comparing a pandemic period to a war period, and I think it's not a bad one, and it's one that Alan touched on earlier. And after wars, First World War, Second World War, the revolution that happened here in 1916, there's always a divergence in views, and some people want things to go back to the way they were, and some people want things to be different. And I'm one of those who wants things to be different, to have a stronger economy and a better society when all of this is over. As I said earlier, hanging on to the things we learned and reclaiming the things that we miss most, but not going back to some of the things that weren't so good. Obviously, there's the whole issue of future-proofing our economy and society, and as well many of the horizontal issues that we need to deal with, the pathway to a low-carbon economy, and also the focus on education and skills, because I don't think anyone involved in this event today would doubt the enormous value of education when it comes to building a better economy and a better society. That is, yes, about third level, but it also starts with preschool and childcare and those early years. And in many ways, it's those investments in those early years that can produce the best return. And one thing I was very proud of being part of in previous governments was ensuring that every child had 2 years of free preschool, putting in place things like the National Childcare Scheme to subsidise childcare, and things like parental leave and paid parental leave. But that should only be the start of this. We should invest a lot more, I think, in early years education in the years to come, and no economic plan would be an economic plan worth having if it isn't willing to deal with some of those issues like third level and fourth level education, but also those really important early years as well, around preschool and early education. So challenges and opportunities. I think they are tilted to the positive, generally speaking. Obviously, the challenges are there. We all know about Brexit, and I don't need to tell anyone here anything they don't already know about Brexit. But one thing I would say about it, and I remember one of the first cabinet meetings I was at, just after the referendum had happened, and Michael Noonan, the finance minister at the time, said something that really has rung true ever since then. And he said, some people think Brexit is a passing storm. It's a bad storm, we're going to weather it and it'll be fine afterwards. And he said it's not that, it's more like political climate change. It's a permanent change in the European Union's relationship with the UK, and therefore a permanent change in our relationship with the UK. And it doesn't all end with or without a free trade agreement at the end of this year. It's probably going to be something more like the relationship that the European Union has with Switzerland, or hopefully Switzerland and not one of our other bordering neighbours like Turkey, for example, where there will be ongoing treaties, ongoing tensions, ongoing issues, and new agreements and new relationships having to be negotiated all the time. And there may be political changes in Britain, for example. If there's a return of a Labour government, they may wish to have a much closer relationship with the single market in a few years' time. Who knows? But this is not, it's not just one event. It's going to be an ongoing new set of relationships that we have with the UK, and of course all the more reason to strengthen the Good Friday Agreement, which is all based on the idea of a totality of relationships in Northern Ireland, North, South and East, West as well. So that's going to be just a new climate we're going to have to manage politically for the next 10, 20 years. Obviously there's the carbon transition, the difficulties that's going to create for business, for communities, for certain regions, as old industries are wound down. And there are geopolitical tensions, which are enormous, really. What's going to happen in terms of the international tax landscape? Very favourable for Ireland at the moment, unlikely to be as favourable in the future as it is now. But we need to get ahead of that and make sure that we are part of the solution to any changes that happen in international taxation, rather than trying to pretend that they're not going to happen, because they are, and it's better that we're part of shaping that solution. There'll be issues around trade, a move towards protectionism and away from free trade in large parts of the world. I see it already at European trade ministers' meetings, where we talk about strategic autonomy, about resilience, about resourcing and reshoring European production and investment screening. And some of that's a really good idea, but some of it is code for protectionism. Protectionism is on the march again in Europe, with the UK gone, and France and Germany, particularly France, in a more influential position than it was. And protectionism is now a feature of US politics. In the past, the Republicans were the free traders. They're definitely not that anymore. Trump's Republican Party is a different party, and the Democrats were a little bit more sceptical about free trade, but now have actually had to follow Trump down that line. So I don't think a change of administration, whether it happens or not, in January in the US will mean a fundamental change in trade policy. It might be a better behaved administration in the way it conducts its business around the world, but I don't think it's going to be back to the old America. It won't be the America of Obama or Clinton in any way, in terms of how it sees its place in the world. And that's going to affect us as well. And touching then on that whole theme of how this pandemic has affected our economy in the way a war has, there's a really good chance that this pandemic will change the pecking order in the world. Now, we don't know how it's going to pan out yet, but a lot of us feel that coming out of this pandemic, Europe and America, and to a lesser extent India, will be somewhat weakened, and China much strengthened. A country that was able to control its pandemic very quickly, and a country that is returning to normal economic activity. But it was their system, their not democratic system, that allowed them to achieve many of those things. And there will be people in the world outside of America and Europe who look to China as the model for their country into the future, who might have looked to America or Europe in the past. So I think it'll bring about a change in the pecking order and a real challenge to us and our values to maintain those values of democracy and human rights and individual freedom, which are not held universally around the world. On the opportunity side, huge opportunities out of climate action, the opportunity to create new jobs, to build new businesses, to turn Ireland from a net energy importer to a net energy exporter. Huge opportunities there, and I'm determined to make sure that we in the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment see climate action as creating enterprise, trade and employment opportunities, not something to be feared, something to be embraced. But it must happen with a just transition, not just for individuals and regions, but also for companies. There's a digital transformation as well, very much underway. The pandemic has caused a seismic shift in that sense, has caused us to accelerate in a way we never would have thought possible. Things like home working and remote working, for example, and embracing new ways of working. And the pandemic has changed the world of work in that regard, but opportunities arise from that as a country that has a strong tech sector, opportunities to really enable many more people to work remotely from small towns and villages, getting jobs and revenue back into those small towns and villages. It might actually be the game changer in terms of reviving rural Ireland in a way that we weren't able to do in the past, particularly small towns and villages, allowing people to work at home more, opening up opportunities for people with disabilities who couldn't get certain work, now being able to work from home and work from remote hubs, and also will cause us, I think, to reimagine our cities. I'd be fairly certain that the new world is going to be one of blended work, with people maybe spending 1 or 2 days in the office and HQ, 1 or 2 days at home, maybe 1 or 2 days in the remote hub. And that's going to mean a lot less footfall and a lot of change in our cities, and will cause us to rethink things like transport investment, for example, how that would work and what we need and what we don't, and will also cause us to rethink how we use our street spaces, and perhaps less for cars, more for pedestrians, more for cyclists, and more for outdoor tables and all of those things. So lots of really exciting things to talk about and think about today, and I know that's exactly what's going to happen in the sessions that are ahead. So in terms of the various different workout groups, the first breakout session is based on the theme of building resilience across enterprise sectors. As we know, the pandemic in many ways has exposed many fault lines in our society and our economy, and one of those, once again, is the gap between our domestic orientated firms and those that are export orientated, affecting sectors very differently, and affecting the non-traded sector being disproportionately affected by the crisis, and those labour-intensive areas like hospitality in particular, but also to a lesser extent retail. So the kind of things that we're going to ask that session to really focus on is how we can maintain and grow FDI in an increasingly competitive and uncertain global environment. This recession is totally different from the last, but there's one thing that is the same, and that is that our multinational sector has shown its strength, its resilience, and also its ability to grow even in a period of an enormous recession. And we're so lucky to have those pharma companies, med tech companies, medical devices, tech companies here in Ireland, because they're holding up our tax base, holding up our employment, and we need to learn the lesson from 2 recessions now, that the FDI sector is part of the backbone of our economy, and that we need to make sure that we continue to keep it here, nurture it, and seek more FDI in the years ahead. Another thing we've talked about for a very long time is how we can improve our SMEs. We have an SME task force now working on the SME aspect of this plan, but we do want people to talk about it here today. How we can close the productivity gap between SMEs and international companies, how they can diversify and digitize, and also become more dynamic into the future. In terms of the second theme, which is building an inclusive and balanced recovery, and that's going to be led by Minister Humphreys. And the whole theme there is that an unequal crisis needs to have a more equal and more inclusive and balanced recovery. We know that younger workers, migrant workers, those with more vulnerable terms and conditions, those in the private sector, those who are self-employed, have been much more adversely affected by this pandemic than those of us who work in the public sector or work in big companies or in the semi-states. And that's totally unfair. That people who just happen to be in a customer-facing type of job have been affected in the way that they have. And I think that raises the bar for us to make sure that the new economy that we build has a higher floor for everyone. That threshold of decency below which nobody can fall should be higher, and has more job security for more people, ranging from issues we've been working on for years, like auto enrollment, for example, making sure that everyone who works has access to a pension fund, an occupational pension, but other issues too, what we can do around our social insurance fund. The reason why we created the pandemic unemployment payment is we as a government couldn't face the idea of hundreds of thousands of people all of a sudden having to get by on €203 a week. So we created an income-linked insurance system for those who lost their job. Shouldn't that have been there always? The same thing might apply, for example, to sick pay. We couldn't face the idea that people might not stay off work, might not go for a test, might not isolate. So we had to create the enhanced illness benefit payment all of a sudden one day. But do we not need a proper sick pay regime? Because the same thing applies to other viruses. We don't want people going to work spreading other viruses either, or going to work when they need to get better. So they're the kind of things I think that have to be discussed in the context of any economic plan as well. So it's going to be about activation as well, how that can be reimagined in the context of a pandemic, how we can reduce barriers of entry and progression within the labour market to target higher quality jobs. What do improved living standards and well-being look like? How should those be measured? There's a commitment in the programme for government to develop a new well-being index. Some exist already, but we want to develop one that's bespoke for Ireland. And also, as I mentioned, how we can really make balanced regional development happen, something we talk about and have been talking about for as long as I can remember, but what really works? It can't just be about, valuable as they are, schemes for grants to improve streetscapes and squares and so on. What will actually bring the private sector, what will actually bring the market economy into regional areas and into small towns and villages, and that's something that I think we can talk about too. The third theme, which is future-proofing our economy and society. This is going to be led by Minister Eamon Ryan. And that's how we discuss the transition to a low-carbon economy. One of the reasons why this government was formed was to accelerate climate action, to go from being a laggard to a leader when it comes to climate change, and we're really committed to that. I think we've made a good start with the climate bill just published the other day. With what you've seen in the July stimulus and the budget in terms of capital investment in areas that will bring about decarbonisation and climate action, and also in the decision that we've made to legislate for a carbon tax and increase it automatically every year, sending out a very clear indication to consumers, to businesses, to everyone as to what investments they should and should not make. I know on all of those issues, I think Minister Ryan is going to have ideas, but want to very much lead the conversation there as to how we make all that happen. So the next steps in terms of the plan, obviously today we have the consultation, which you're all very much part of. We wanted to get the budget done first. We will kick off a review of Project Ireland 2040, the National Development Plan as well, which I think Minister McGrath will speak about a little bit later. Our plan is to have this published by the end of November, middle to end of November. The virus has a habit of making a mockery of all our plans, so there may well be a case to put it off perhaps to December or to the new year, but as of now, we're heading for November, and we won't write it and we won't agree it unless we set a hard deadline, and that hard deadline is to have it ready before the end of November, so we can publish it at the end of November. And obviously, linked to that as well, in the budget is set aside a €3.4 billion fund for Brexit and for COVID response. And as part of that plan, I think we can start to allocate some of that, so that it's not just a plan to be funded, it is a plan with funding, and we we can start the funding of it as soon as we announce it. So sorry for going on too long if I did, and thanks very much for your attention. Look forward to touching base with everyone later on. Thanks a mil.